Cool. It's 1 after the hour, so let's get started. So we have a few items on the agenda, and we might have time for some additional items at the end of the meeting. Welcome to the April 2020 OpenZFS Leadership Meeting. So let's get started with George had a topic about libshare that he wanted to discuss.
Yeah, so I've kind of brought up some of these issues that we've seen in the past with like libshare and kind of the implementation that we had seen on Linux. And we've done like some performance analysis, and we were seeing that there was kind of some inefficiencies. And I think overall the Linux community hasn't really embraced using like the share NFS property, but at Delphix we use it quite a bit. So we kind of decided that we would look to see, could we simplify this, revamp it. And so I've been doing some work on this, and effectively what I'm proposing is to combine, there's some work that I think FreeBSD has already done in what they're calling libZFS FS share. And the work that I've done, which is to pretty much burn down the old share tab. So I'm still keeping something called libshare, but it's vastly different than what it was before and much simplified. But the idea would be that we would have a OS specific libshare. So we would have a Linux version, a FreeBSD version. I would effectively have rewritten the logic that's in libZFS FS share to be now a libshare for FreeBSD. And what I've been doing is kind of testing out, some of the functionality specifically with Linux to see what kind of performance gains we can get. And they're pretty dramatic. The simplification of libshare has given us like a 99% improvement. So right now I've kind of been testing with like a relatively simple case with like 1,000 file systems, and I create just a bunch of multi-threaded processes trying to all share different file systems at the same time, because we were seeing that is the worst case scenario when you ran with the old share tab and old libshare logic. And with those cases, we've gone from instances where it would take us, several minutes to share out those file systems to now about 20 seconds. So we were seeing improvements across the board on like sharing, unsharing, inheriting the share NFS property. I can kind of go through some of the numbers if people are interested, but the proposal here is really to simplify libshare. It would still allow consumers like Illumos to come in sometime later and have their own libshare logic or utilize the old libshare logic. So, but it simplifies the current structure and removes a lot of like the kind of quadratic cases where we were running over like multiple lists, several different times trying to determine if something was shared or if it was mounted. And it's mostly removal of code. There is some additions, but it's mostly a lot of burning down of old code.
For what it's worth, I'd appreciate if we could call it something other than libshare, because we already have a libshare. But otherwise...
It uses, yeah. So I modeled it after the Illumos logic. So it uses kind of the same entry points. So if like the libshare logic kind of does the same thing, if at some point in time we get to a point where we have like a combined code base, because we have the same entry points, we should be able to still have like the same vectors. So today, the logic I have, requires the consumers to create a NFS, an NFS component and an SMB component, even though like FreeBSD doesn't have SMB. So it should be relatively easy for Illumos to just come in and kind of build the same logic. We would just store it under an OS specific libshare. And then the rest of the code remains common. So, the logic that's in libZFS mount could be used by all different, distributions.
Maybe I spaced out when you were saying this before, but did you want to touch on like how the Linux, new Linux like libshare works in terms of like updating that file and then
Sure.
kicking the existing NFS server and whatnot?
Yeah. So the original code or the existing code kind of relies on maintaining the share tab file, which is not used very often, and then kind of calling exportfs explicitly to export each individual file system. What I've created now is leveraging some logic that exists in exportfs, which allows us to create a file within the exports.d directory in Linux. And so I have now a zfs.exports file that we maintain for NFS shares. For SMB shares, there's no longer a common file. So that's the share tab logic in the past used to have one file that could hold both NFS and SMB shares. For Linux, and FreeBSD is kind of a similar beast, but for Linux, there is no common file anymore. It's like there's two different repositories that are used. For SMB, it's like var lib, samba, user shares. And for NFS, it's etc exports.d, zfs.exports. And the advantage of using that for NFS is that the NFS server logic knows to go look there whenever you restart or kick the NFS server and tell it to reread any exports. So by having this file, we can actually maintain it as users do ZFS share, NFS or share NFS equal on or off. It gets updated directly. And then if you ever restart the NFS server in the middle, it would automatically read this file, which is being kept consistent based on what's available on disk. So we don't have to go kind of rebuild it every time. And the same thing's true for like the Samba shares, which live in a different directory and are consumed on reboot. So Michael asked if we had iSCSI or Fiber Channel on the radar. We haven't looked at the old, and this holds true even for Lumos. There is some dead property for like, the sharing of iSCSI directly from ZFS. As far as I know, nobody has looked at kind of revamping that and kind of bringing that up to date to make it usable either with, the Linux iSCSI server or the Lumos, in kernel iSCSI server. So that would be an interesting project for folks to look at. That would be a nice way and a nice win for ZFS, for the ZFS community.
I think there's an extent to which it's even more complicated to configure an iSCSI target than it is an NFS export. So.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's further complicated on Linux too because we have multiple iSCSI implementations.
Even if you had a fully abstract notion of like all of the possible configurable stuff, like it could still be like a paragraph of text in the property,
Yeah.
Just because the property can hold, was it 4 or 8 kilobytes of text doesn't mean you want to stuff that in there, right?
Yeah, I think that's even with like SMB on Linux, I think the only thing that it currently supports is for using share SMB is on and off. So it's a limited implementation there, and I don't know if anybody on the call is using the share SMB functionality in Linux or is more familiar with kind of some of the properties, but that would also be a place where there could be some improvements going forward.
Cool. Any more questions for George on the share SMB work?
And I hope to get a PR up. So I'm looking for FreeBSD reviewers to kind of look at that implementation as well.
Cool. All right. then let's move on to the status updates. I think that was the only like discussion topic that we had on the agenda so far. So some of these are holdovers from last week that we didn't get to, or last month, excuse me. Josh, do you want to give an update on the Panzura dedupe improvements?
Sure, yeah. So initially, the people that did that dedupe stuff said it was incredibly self-contained and would apply to any version of ZFS, and we very quickly discovered that's not the case. And then, well, we've been sort of working on trying to get that untangled so that we can get a PR posted that applies to the current state of the world. Panzer has been caught in a bunch of funding and stuff, business stuff, and so they've frozen that whole thing. So for right now, nothing is happening, but once the business drama gets sorted out, we hope to resume back on getting those changes untangled for some other things, getting them to apply to the upstream. The end goal, of course, is that we have a bunch of, Panzer has a bunch of ZFS technology we'd like to see make its way out into the wild, and that would benefit us by allowing us to take advantage of some of the newer OpenZFS features as well. So we're kind of stuck. Well, as you can imagine, we've diverged quite a bit and there's no clear road back into the fold. So that's what I got.
Thanks. Sounds like a great goal at least, and you know, we'd love to see Panzura you know, take advantage of the upstream changes and then also contribute their changes back to the community.
Yep. Yeah, I think it would be a win for everybody. So
cool. Any questions on that? All right, then the next item I had was Alan, status on the dedupe log and DDT limit work.
So the DDT limit stuff is coming along nicely. We just finished addressing another round of the review feedback on the DDT limit, which were a bunch of nice changes. We managed to get the diff down a bit and to name the properties, I think it was DDT table limit or quota, to fit the naming with everything else in ZFS better, which I think is very important because one of the things I like most about ZFS is how consistent all the naming and everything is. So getting that right was important. So that one we think is almost finished. We had one open question about in between syncs of the DDT when we're estimating how much we expect the DDT is going to grow from these new writes. You'd wanted to use some static number, and I don't know what to base that on.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably, we can probably take this to the pull request. I think that it was, but yeah, I think that originally you were using some, also just like some number that was based on something, but I was basically suggesting that we make it more explicit that this is a number which is just kind of pulled out of the air,
right?
And not actually related to, you know, like we don't really know how much space that's going to use on disk.
Right.
So just having like a macro that explicitly is like, this is an estimate of how much space each new record in the DDT table will use on disk.
Right.
Okay. But yeah, I'm happy to do another round on the code review there. Do you have any thoughts on how any of this will interact with the dedupe stuff that Josh was talking about, or is it like we don't really know exactly since we haven't seen the code yet?
Yeah, we don't know exactly. It mostly was this was to put out things that were on fire today.
Yeah.
You know, ideally, you know, the Panzer dedupe solves the problem better, and we don't have the problem. But the work we've been doing mostly is, you know, customers that already have dedupe tables that are taking, you know, over 200 gigs of RAM. and they need to make something more manageable. So I don't know if anybody's interested in the other patch we have, which is basically a bulk purge of all unique entries from the DDT. It's not really that user serviceable. It's kind of an extra flag to zpool import that says, you know, on import, just drop that whole zap and recreate an empty one. So it's not really something I think makes sense upstream, but if people have a use case for it, I suppose we could put it somewhere.
Well, we have a use case for it, or the clients do.
Right.
So other people might. It is, however, a bit specialized since we keep telling them not to use the dedup table.
And then for dedup log, they've made a little progress there, but not that much. It looks like dedup log is mostly meant, from my understanding, to solve the problem of dedup using a lot of IOPS with all the updates. Yeah. And the trade-off seems to be to use more memory, and their biggest problem being a backup provider is they need to use less memory. So the dedup log doesn't look like it's actually going to solve the problems they were hoping it would.
Gotcha. Yeah, that sounds right. For the dedup table limit, I think maybe it's worth a couple of things. One, reminding folks that this you kind of changed the semantics of that from the initial PR. So now it's about limiting the amount of disk space that's used. So the goal being like, so that you can make sure that it fits into a special or dedup type VDEV that you've added. Yep. Yeah. Rather than like explicitly being about memory usage. Obviously it'll have an impact on like the maximum memory that could be used if you cache the whole dedup table, but it isn't like explicitly setting something that would do that.
Right, because the problem with limiting memory is that it's even less predictable than the on-disk size because of the compression and so on. And in particular, it also doesn't necessarily shrink just because you removed some entries, and that was causing some usability problems. It's like, oh, we've hit the DDT limit, and then we delete 100,000 entries, and the table doesn't gain any space, and you still can't write to it.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that because the dedup table is a giant hash table, like you delete those entries, they're spread like ideally as evenly as possible among all the blocks. Yeah. So it's like you're removing one entry from each block, which might or may not cause that block to actually like compress down to the next smaller size that's available.
Right.
And I think that's exacerbated by the fact that the dedup table is stored on, like it uses it, the zap that it uses is special and it has like a smaller block size.
Yeah, that's something we wanted to look at, because I think the block size is only 4 or 8K or something, and maybe a larger one would get more compression and would possibly actually alleviate the memory pressure now that we have compressed ARC.
Yeah, and I'd hate to see like, if you're using that with 4K disks, you're not going to get barely any compression at all, if anything. And then I'd hate to see if you use that on RAID Z, you're going to get huge inflation in the disk space used by your dedup table. So.
Yeah, a lot of kind of hidden bombs in the dedup stuff, just because not many people have used it for so long.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there, and I think it's great that you're looking at addressing, some of the most obvious things, like putting the limit here on the disk space used.
Yeah, it would be. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say it's later in the agenda, but I would like to get some eyeballs on the other one, the DDT load command that's been out for a while, which basically allows you after a reboot to trigger loading the entire DDT. Basically, just reads it all into the ARC, because in the case where you have a DDT that was 200 gigs, it would take 4 or 5 days sometimes for most of that to end up in the cache, to the point where performance went back to something reasonable. And we'd just like to get that merged before it gets too far out of date.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think actually both of those, it would be good, if you haven't already, to send a message out to the developer at OpenZFS mailing list, just since there are new features, new user interface, property names and whatnot, to make sure that we can get feedback from the broadest range of folks. And also included in those folks, maybe if Josh or anybody else that has outstanding improvements to dedup, to take a look at those and about like, assuming that you eventually, your, huge improvements to dedup upstreamed interact with this, with properties that Alan is talking about adding.
Yeah, I mean, I can write that up. We basically have made their name on their dedup implementation. They released a series of white papers about that. And we did a clean room re-implementation of that dedup from their white papers. So it's essentially giving OpenZFS the data domain dedup implementation. It's 100% incompatible with the current stuff. So it's an on-disk format change, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
We're going to have to address that at some point, dedup v2 or, I mean, my impression is pools are going to have to be able to support both for a while. And there's going to have to be a way to disambiguate them.
Yeah, I guess my thought was that it would be like the concept of like preloading the dedup table, or the concept of putting limit on the disk space used by the dedup table, like seems like it should be applicable to any implementation, whether it's the current one, the dedup log, or this very different one that you're talking about, Josh. So it would be nice to like validate that and then be able to continue using those properties to set limits, even if we transition to this totally different implementation later on. Does that make sense?
Yep. I will say our implementations, depends on having the dedup table on SSD. And I think that OpenZFS has the capability now to put metadata on specific VDEVs. And so that's going to be a predicate of this, because getting dedup metadata on spinning disk is just a game over scenario, no matter what technology you use to do dedup. So.
Yeah. So, I mean, it sounds like it would all work together very well, but just want to make sure you guys are aware, and like, this would be the good time to give feedback if that's not the case. If it seems like it doesn't work, it wouldn't work with your implementation, or if we would want to do things differently, then it would be good to know that now so that you don't run into more speed bumps down the road.
Okay. Yeah, I think it should be fine.
Cool.
Yeah. I mean, we're using this with multi-petabyte data sets at this point and not really having a huge issue with the dedup. But of course, our use case is everything is cloud out. So, the WAN link to the cloud becomes the choke point, not dedup itself. And so even people who are doing on-prem object store stuff, typically speaking, that's a 10 gigabit link is about the fastest it is. So, and we're fast enough to keep up with that. But, what happens in a local storage situation where, you can write the disk at 40 gigabit, hard to say. So.
Well, I think that dedup at 10 gigabit is like, sounds like nirvana to me.
Yeah, well,
yeah, you got a really big smile on your face, Matt.
Yeah. Cool. Any more questions on dedup log, dedup limit, or the dedup load stuff? Sounds like Alan's looking for reviewers for the dedup load, and I guess also the limit, the dedup limit PRs. I know I owe you a review for the load thing.
Thank you.
Cool. All right. Let's move on. The next couple of items are just kind of things that we want to let people know about. The first one I had was the persistent L2 arc. I know, Brian, do you want to talk at all about that? And that was merged. You want to talk about just FYI, like what that means, anything that folks should look out for?
Yeah, I can talk about that for a minute. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Good. So yeah, the persistent L2ARC stuff went in. There are actually a couple follow-up patches that could use reviewers for that too. I can point you at them if you want to. But basically it means that everything merged, and at least in master, you'll have a persistent arc. This was the modified version of persistent L2ARC that came from Nexenta originally. I'm not sure there's much to add to that.
Cool. Yeah, there's nothing to configure, right? It's just like, kind of just works. The first time you boot up on the new stuff, it'll be writing out metadata onto the L2ARC device to keep track of what's there. And then when you open a pool that has that metadata on it, it'll suck it back in and basically recreate the in-memory state in terms of like knowing what blocks are in the L2ARC.
Yeah, that's right. I think the only minor noteworthy thing is it's a new feature, but it didn't come with a feature flag because you can lose the L2ARC at any time, so it's not really a problem. So there's a log header on disk, and if everything looks good, it'll rebuild it. And if it doesn't, it'll just discard it. So no problem there. So it didn't require a feature flag.
Cool. Any questions about that? All right. The next one I wanted to mention, I realized that we didn't cover this at last month's, I think, but the dedup send receive work. So I was working on this. We proposed, I think it might have been 3 or 4 years ago, to deprecate the dedup send and receive functionality. So this is confusingly, this is actually basically not at all related to on-disk dedup. And that confusion is one of the reasons that we wanted to get rid of it. This is the ZFS send --dedup or ZFS send --D flags. And those are now deprecated. They're going to be deprecated in the 0.8.3 release. And then the code is now removed on OpenZFS master. So that functionality isn't there anymore. And we sent out a bunch of emails about that, got very little feedback. Did not seem like people were using that, which is what we were hoping and expecting. The folks that were using it seemed to be confused about what it actually did, which is also what we expected. So now you can still run with those flags, but it'll just print out a warning message saying like, hey, like we're not actually generating a dedup send stream.
One minor correction. It'll be in 0.8.4 actually.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Presumably it will send faster now for those people.
Yeah, I mean, it's a trade-off, right? Like the dedup send uses a bunch of memory and it like rechecksums everything.
Right.
If you aren't already using a dedup capable checksum. But like the send stream might be smaller. So yeah, it's like you're kind of trading off CPU and memory for bandwidth potentially.
And you could always gzip it still.
Yeah,
anyway.
and I mean, the send stream with send -- compressed, it'll send data as it is on disk. So if it's already compressed on disk, then it'll send it compressed over the wire with no additional CPU usage, which is like a huge win, and how I wish it had been from day one. Cool. Any questions about that? All right. So now, oh, Jorgen turned off his video. Now I was going to put Jorgen on the spot. Oh, there you are, Jorgen. And ask you about the work that you've been doing on OpenZFS for OSX common repo. Okay. I saw a bunch of you know, commits in your, I don't know if it's a pull request or a test repo or whatever, but I'd love to hear about like what you're doing and kind of what you see as the future of that work, and you know, what other folks can do to help.
Well, since we got FreeBSD in the Linux repository, I figured I would try to do the same if I would be eventually, you know, allowed in. We'll see. So I figured the best thing was to start from the beginning and just take the Linux repository or the FreeBSD repository, whatever we call the shared one, and apply the OSX changes again. And it given me a great chance to redo some of the things that are a little bit old and wrong. We have come across a few things that were not entirely right. And I think we've even found one or two things for Linux and FreeBSD to look at in their code, nothing major, but there are in my project page some little notes about that I will eventually share with Brian and who is in charge of FreeBSD. If Brian is the king of Linux.
Matt Macy did a lot of the work to port it over. So
yeah, I'll bring it up with him, man. Maybe, yeah. But it's nothing too exciting there. Whether or not it will be accepted, we'll see. Some of the bigger changes will be interesting to see what you guys think of them. In particular, the UIO changes that I had to do. Not too many, but there are a few. Yeah, and I guess the eventual goal is to have it join with the repo, if it can.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And I'm pretty interested in what the changes needed are too. Hopefully we got most things factored out. So, but if we do need to do more refactoring, that's fine.
No, it was, yeah, a lot of it was done by Matt Macy. It's done really well. So it was not a problem there. Obviously they don't do assembler the same way. So they didn't they could have kept going and that the way they have done things the whole way, but they stopped at assembler. So I just kind of continued that to make sure it was sort of done the same way. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd also love to see it combined with the common repo. I think the only real thing that I would be concerned about holding it back is testing. Like, you know, we want to make sure that whatever is supported by the common repo is tested by, you know, automated testing when you open pull requests, because obviously we can't expect everybody to like have an OSX machine to test their changes on manually.
Yep.
So
I set up the CI quite early on, so I know that works at least, and it starts to test it. It just doesn't, you know, actually complete in a test. But I figured you'd only want to talk to me when it does a test run with everything is green. So at that point, I will talk to everyone.
Cool. Oh, and the other question I had was, you mentioned like trying to do some things better second time around. Are you looking at or considering changing any of the on-disk format decisions that you did? Because I vaguely recall that there were some things like in the ZPL or like, you know, assumptions about, I forget what now, you know, like file locations and extended attributes and things like that, that we had discussed like, oh yeah, that's kind of like not quite the ideal way of doing it. But you know, you already made that decision, so like OSX is kind of stuck with it. Are you considering changing any of that stuff, or are you kind of assuming that the current format that you're using for OSX is set in stone?
This is actually a great time for you to come in and give you comments on those changes, because I consider it to be a new port, which means that there are definitely some changes that the user will have to get used to, in that the existing version, we call the property mimic HFS, because we have to lie and say we're HFS for all the applications to allow us to write to it, so to speak. But since HFS has been dropped, it was kind of a bad name. So we will just call it Mimic. So, and then you can set it to what you want to pretend to be.
Do you now have to pretend to be APFS? Or?
Right, that's exactly it, right? We're going to have to support that. So rather than having Mimic HFS and Mimic APFS, we figure we just call it Mimic, and then you set it to be either HFS or APFS.
Really feels like they've stripped the V out of VFS.
Right, and I mean, I can't just complain about Apple there, because I had to do the same thing on Windows. It has to report that it's NTFS or nothing will talk to it. So,
how many other file systems are there rattling around out there that they've had to?
You installed something like Adobe Photoshop. Not that I'm picking on them, but it just refuses to even touch it if it says it's ZFS as opposed to HFS.
All right, cool. Well, I mean, it sounds like you're open to kind of treating this as like, you might have an old pool on an old OSX pool, but you might not necessarily be able to like bring it forward to this new combined.
Right. I mean, Apple has had this with the Zevo version of the pools before. We kind of import them, but there are definitely things that we can't handle. Like Zevo stored all its ACLs in the extended attributes, and not as ZFS normally store them. But it would also be nice if you could, if there was a path for them to come to the new version. But that's something we can discuss.
All right, cool. Well, sounds like a good opportunity.
Mm.
Cool. Any other questions about OSX in the common repo? All right.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Hello. Hi. So just a quick note. So I would love to see like all the ports in one repo. And what we could do is to do what FreeBSD does with architectures that are not like very mature, just use tier 1 category for them. So basically there are different guarantees for those tier 2 ports. So they're in the repo, but maybe they don't have to build all the time. They don't have to pass all the tests. They don't have to be complete. So, but they are there. So if somebody commits the code, basically he can check out all the ports and try to do do his best. Right?
Yeah, I think that's something that we could consider. I mean, thankfully, FreeBSD is like mature enough that, there wasn't that much development work between like it works in the common repo and like it works kind of in the common repo and it's totally solid. I mean, obviously there was a bunch of work
what I meant
between
about
those, but not.
FreeBSD was that that we have ports to like PowerPC, libs, and those kinds of that we call tier 2, right? But yeah, so for example, now FreeBSD in Linux would be tier 1, and OS 10 could be tier 2 for now, at least, or something like that.
FreeBSD we didn't need to say that FreeBSD was tier 2 because like it was so mature.
No. What he's saying is use it, do the same nomenclature that the FreeBSD project does, not that FreeBSD itself is tier 2.
Yeah, I understand. That's what you're saying, Powell.
Yeah.
And yes, it's great that we didn't need to do that for FreeBSD. We'll evaluate if we need to do that for OSX. I think it depends a lot on, like, first it needs to be running, right? And then we can see like if like how much effort it is to bring that up to where we want it to be in terms of like testing and stuff, automated testing, testability, and then based on that, figure out like if it makes sense to introduce a new like tier 2 compatibility or just have it be the same as everything as Linux and FreeBSD. Okay. So, oh, somebody added something. ZPL user properties. All right, Alan, do you want to go ahead and
Yeah, so
say a
this
few
came
words
up,
about
I
that?
think, on the last call and as a solution to some other problem as well. And actually, Pavel was asking me about it earlier this week. And since I did a lot of the plumbing around it on the VDEV property stuff, which is almost finished, which I hope to upstream soon, I was just wondering, does anybody else have a use for user properties on zpools? And is there any considerations that we might want to take into mind before I, finish plumbing it out and create a pull request?
I think it would be fine. I mean, I think in that thread, there are a couple of like potential workarounds listed of, things that you could do kind of to get equivalent functionality with the current features. But yeah, I mean, it seems pretty straightforward.
So one comment I would have on this one is that currently any user can access all properties, right? And I was wondering how hard would it be to be able to, but of course properties are not very simple, just name and value. But I could make use of hidden, let's say, hidden properties that keep some kind of secret, so not every user can just ask for the value. Just like with some configuration file that has some secret, I can use permissions, but it doesn't have to be permissions, but just differentiation between regular property and some say hidden or sensitive property.
I actually played with that a bit, not for pools, but for data sets when I was working on the system alias properties. It did not turn out very good, but admittedly I only spent a couple days on it.
Would you want full ACL support, or would you just want root and non-root?
Just run, not root. That would be, for me, it would be enough.
Presumably, though, on at least some platforms, there is the root not root distinction is generally less important than like certain privileges being granted to the user or not, for instance.
Well,
if you're going to go that route, then having the whole privilege set that it already has, adding more privileges to be able to look at secret properties or whatnot wouldn't be all that difficult.
What sort of secrets do you want to store in there? Obviously you don't have to tell me the actual secret, just the class of secret, because it's
well, it depends. Well, for example, if I would like to, let's say, do a backup of the entire pool, and for example, be able to, I don't want to keep the secret somehow within the backup itself, or basically I will just have, or this is also my idea for pool-wide properties, that I don't want the properties to be inherited to every single data set, and basically just be able to have this option in case I need this for stuff like encryption or.
Yeah, I guess I think the biggest problem I could foresee there is, you can use like ZDB to just read the raw zap, and that might make it too easy to go around the.
No. Of course, it's.
Yeah, you have to be root to do ZDB, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Exactly. So basically, the idea is to treat it as like some kind of configuration file that is readable only by root, but not stored as the data, as the actual data within the pool.
In a pinch, you could presumably just create another data set, right? And put files in that and manage ACLs in the usual way.
I think I would want to see some specific examples and try to, hate the term, but kind of bite shed them to see what the flaws are with the cases he comes up with.
Yeah, to at least be able to reason about what we need to protect. Because, you know, conceptually, we could, you know, use another special character instead of colon or whatever that we currently use for user properties to denote, you know, root properties or whatever. But then we have to make sure that we're actually satisfying the requirements that we want for these other class of properties.
I think it would be easy to build something too simple to be generally useful.
Yeah.
If we don't have good, strong use cases in mind.
I agree. I will think about this some more. I was just not really spend too much time on it because it's not there. But definitely, if we would have to go with all the let's say allow protocol that we have now for all kinds of being able to read the property and who can read the property, then probably that would be too complicated for some.
Right, and the allow stuff currently is only ZFS, not zpool, right?
Yeah,
I think so. Yeah.
that's to allow system administration by normal users. I think that what you're I agree with what's been said so far, and I think that what you're asking for could be done. It's not like super simple, but I think that there's some other examples of like properties that have been added that are a little bit special, and I think that the user and group and I think now project space accounting is not readable by everybody. So I think that you have to be privileged to get those. And there's like different IACTLs for getting them than for getting like normal properties. So you kind of go down some kind of road like that of like, you'd add a new IACTL, that IACTL would only be accessible by root, that would get this set of special properties. And then like all the userland stuff has to be taught about like, you know, oh, there's this new class of properties that I have to ask that you know that I can get with this other IACTL and whatnot.
Yeah, but what I was thinking about were user properties, which makes it even more complicated because we would need to introduce some kind of way to tag them as
in iteration and all this kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, but I've dealt with a chunk of that because I basically support user properties on VDEVs because I wanted to be able to, you know, mark a bunch of properties of a disk so that, you know, even after a disk fails, I can find out what its serial number was so I can replace the right disk.
Cool. I think we're running close to the end of the hour, so why don't we move on to review requests. So first, actually, I guess maybe all of these are from Alan now. So Alan, do you want to talk about your Z standard, dedup load, and dedup ceiling? Just like, you know, what the status is, who you'd like to see reviews from, etc.
The Z standard one, I need to go over again. I got to make sure that the L2ARC changes didn't change anything there. I'm hoping to get time to focus on that one and work it. I think right now it's maybe a little bit too big, so I'd be interested to hear from people what logical divisions would make sense to try to break it out to make it easier to review and get even just, I think originally I had just the bits for tracking the level applied to gzip done as a separate thing first and then import Z standard and then hooking it up the same or something to try to make it a little smaller and easier to review. So definitely interested in any logical chunks people think it makes sense to break it up into. And then the dedup load one, that's been out for a while, could really use some review on that and any feedback people have. And like you said, I'll also send a reminder to the mailing list to try to solicit that. and the dedup ceiling one, Matt was nice enough to give us a bunch of feedback on that about 4 or 5 days ago, and we've addressed most of that and just need to finish cleaning up. And I think that one's pretty close to ready to go.
Cool. For the Z standard one, I know at one point we had like a couple of different PRs for that from different people.
Mm-hmm.
Has that been resolved? Like, is there one PR that everybody agrees we're moving forward with, or what's the latest on that?
I'm not entirely sure.
Okay, it sounds like maybe that can be part of your
yeah,
going back and revisiting and sorting that out.
Yeah, because yeah, there are, I think, 4 different ones. Some of the older ones are closed now, but
okay,
yeah, it's there was a bunch of off-topic discussion happening and so on, and made it hard to follow what's going on in a bunch of it.
Cool. All right, that's all the agenda items that we had, and then some. Any remaining topics or comments for the last 5 minutes of the meeting? Brian, maybe anything about the next 0.8 release for Linux and FreeBSD?
So we're putting it together now. There was a pull request opened with just a bunch of bug fixes, basically. I can look up the number quick, or it's one of the most recent pull requests. If you have any additional patches, critical bug fixes you want to see in there, letting you know, but we're hoping to get it together real soon. It'll be 0.8.4, and it's just a bug fix release. So nothing too exciting there. It's a much smaller patch set than last time. I think 30 patches, something like that, mainly little bug fixes.
Cool. I guess we haven't really talked about this, but with FreeBSD having been integrated, I think that we have all of the features that we want for OpenZFS 2.0, which will be the next major release. We haven't really talked about like what exactly the timeline is from here. Obviously, we want to give a little bit more time to make sure that things soak and that we've shaken out any bugs in FreeBSD as well as other new features. I don't know, Brian, did you have any thoughts on that?
I did, actually. I think we have to decide when to close the door on major new features for this. Like you said, we were just kind of holding the door for FreeBSD. There's a little additional work there to be done, but I think we're maybe at the point where we could start making release candidate tags or something like that for people to start testing. And, it may still be a long time before we get to a final release, but putting something out there that people can start testing maybe would be useful. I'd be open to that idea. Does anyone else have any thoughts on actually tagging taking a release candidate, call it OpenZFS 2.0-RC1 or whatever?
I do have perhaps a related question about what constitutes a new major version in this scheme, I guess, because like
marketing.
It's just so all right. So, but it's not like in the Semver sense.
There's no semantic meaning of.
Okay. So we're just
first number.
Yeah. We're gonna make it bigger when it feels good.
Or the name.
Yeah.
I mean, we are also changing the name from ZFS on Linux to OpenZFS. So.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
it's just like a major release, just like the difference between 0.7 and 0.8. And in fact, I think ZFS on Linux has a track record of changing what is a major, which numbers denote major and minor releases.
Yeah, we've been a little less consistent than I would like about it. But yes, I think moving to a simpler scheme of say OpenZFS 2.0 will be good, and then just major.
And then the plan is to stick with the major releases will change the first number. So like we plan to have major releases like roughly once a year, and they'll change the first number. So it'll be OpenZFS 2.0 sometime in 2020. Hopefully OpenZFS 3.0 sometime in 2021.
Have you thought about using a date scheme like a lot of projects are starting to use, like a 2020 release, 2020 04 or whatever? For April, that is.
Yeah, I hadn't thought
I don't
about
think,
that. Go ahead.
yeah, I haven't either. I don't know that we've ruled anything out. So if there's good arguments for it, that maybe makes sense.
Just that if the intent is for it to be like a time-based release, which seems fine, that's fine. Like I obviously December style, like we can just bump the number and make breaking changes, and it works so well for a file system. But if the intent is to do them on a time basis, a time-based version might help clarify that, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah, we do intend to still have.
Oops.
Sorry, our work is having trouble.
Yeah, it sounds like you cut off.
I think that we do still intend to have like minor releases, like, sub major release designator. But I think that could work in with the date-based one as well. So, yeah, I think we should probably consider that as long as we're changing everything.
I think Ubuntu have an extra number that they stick on the end, like 2020.04.1.2.3.
That definitely has the added advantage of shaming people running very old versions, because you can tell from the version number the date, and it's it's always longer ago than you thought it was.
1995.
Yeah, it is a little tricky because I don't think that we are in a position to be like, it shall be released on in this month. There's still it's still pretty wishy-washy, and it's still we're gonna let it bake until we've got all the bugs shaken out.
Yeah.
I mean, we aren't as well oiled of a machine as Canonical with their, I don't know how many, but I'm assuming at least hundreds of employees compared to our 0.
It's not. I mean, it's not like their April release doesn't come out in May sometimes. So
true.
Yeah.
So we're almost out of time. I saw one last question about the website. We are still working on moving the website to OSU, which I think I mentioned a couple meetings ago. I actually just previewed that today. It is working, and we just need to make the DNS changes to switch that over. So that's well on its way. It should be transparent to everyone, with the exception of we are going to try to change the main URL to be openZFS.org without a dash. So when you go to the other domains, it'll redirect you to openZFS.org, no dash. And we're also going to try to get a Let's Encrypt certificate. So it'll be HTTPS.
Thanks, Michael Dexter, for making that happen.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And hopefully that'll be within the next week. Like I said, we just got that set up I think Friday, and I take a look at making the DNS changes today. So hopefully that'll be done within a week or two. Cool. So thank you all for participating today. The next meeting will be 4 weeks from today, May 26th. And it'll be at the same time as this meeting, right? The later time, 1 p.m. Pacific. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.